going to begin the fifth parak of Shekalim, which is on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. And Amir Hashem will finish up on Shekalim tomorrow, and on Yom Shlishi or maximum Yom Revi'i, we'll start Masechet Yevamos, Be'ezer Hashem. Now the Mishnah talks about what's called Memunim Bamigdash. There's a halacha called Minui. An identical word for Minui is Srara, which means an appointment. And we're going to see exactly how an individual would be appointed. Did we need a Bezdin, and how large of a Bezdin? But the Mishnah is now going to list an enumerated list of 15 different memunim. Each one had his own particular responsibility in the Beis HaMikdash, and the Mishnah actually mentions them by name. So elu hein hamemunim shahayu b'mikdash. And the word memun, as we said before, is someone who's a supervisor. He has to guarantee tara, or he has to guarantee that there's enough funds for various karbanos. Number one on the list is Yochanan ben Pinchas ala Chosamos. And the Gemara is going to discuss what are these seals, S-E-A-L, a seal, a chosem. What do they have to guarantee? The second on the list is Achia al HaNesachim. The Nesachim, of course, had to be brought as accompaniments to a carbon ola or a carbon shlamim, and they had to be tahar. And the word Nesachim could include shemen, it could include the soles, which is the flour, it can include the yayin, of course, the wine, and all these had to be guaranteed for the purpose of nisuch to be betara. So his responsibility, achia, was to guarantee that all the yayin, all the shemen, all the soles that was used for nesachim was in a state of tara. That's what he had to guarantee. And Yochanan was more in charge of the monies, that the monies should be placed as they were earmarked in various receptacles that had a chosem on it. And that would guarantee that there was no embezzlement. But in contrast, Achia was not in charge of monies, but his obligation was rather vis-a-vis what we call Kedushas Haguf, that which is brought on the Mizbeach. In this particular case, Nesachim, and anything that's brought on the Mizbeach has to be brought to Tara and not to Tumah. And then we get to the third responsibility, and that is Masya ben Shmuel al Hapaisos. On a daily, on a daily basis, for that mishmeres of kuhuna, there had to be a pious. The pious was a lottery that would determine which particular kohen would be zocha. Let's say, for example, on a daily basis, there was a Talmid Shel Shachar, a Talmid Shel Ben Arbayim. Which kohen would be in charge of the avoda of that day, of that karma? And lots were chosen, and through these lots, they would determine which kohen had the zchus. He had the inalienable right through the gorol of bringing that carbon in charge of the avoda. And here we have a fellow by the name of Masya ben Shmuel. He's going to oversee the gorolos. Then we move on to the issue of kinim, psachya ala kinim. So there are three categories of women who are obligated to bring a kan tzipor. That's a zava, a yoledes. We are now talking about what we call mechusrei kapara, and until they bring both a chatos and an ola, a pair of birds, one designated as a chatos, the other as an ola, they are not allowed to eat from kodshim. They're not allowed to go into the Beis Hamikdash, even if all the other ingredients of Tara have been fulfilled. And there had to be someone, in this case, Rabbi Psachia, who was in charge. He would oversee all the funds that were collected for a kan sipar, which means two birds. So, for example, Rachel would come in and she would contribute her monies because she was Yoledes. And then Leah would come in. She was perhaps a Zava. She would contribute her monies. And this individual by the name of Psachia, and we'll see later on in the sugya whether his name is mentioned the bracha or chas v'shalom for the opposite. He was in charge of guaranteeing that Rachel would bring her birds from the monies that she brought, that she contributed, and Leah from the monies that she contributed, and there would be no mixture of these funds. Now, technically, Rachel could have brought the birds themselves, the actual birds, but Chazal established a system which would make it easier for her. Instead of her having to go out and buy birds and making sure that there were no mumim, that there was no tumah issue, she would bring the monies, and the gizbar, the treasurer, would be in charge of taking those monies and purchasing the birds on her behalf. But there had to be someone who would preside over the entire operation of purchasing the birds to make sure that the monies that were given by Rachel would go for her carbon and Leah for her carbon. And that was Psachia. Now, the impression you get here from the Taklin Chaditin is that the process of figuring out which modes belong to which, and to make sure that from the collection, there were 13 shofaros in the Migdash, and one of those shofaros was called Kinim, the birds for Yoledes. There were many halachas that had to be ruled upon with regard to how to purchase the birds, how to designate one as chatos, the other as ola, and there's a Masechet called Masechet Kinim that addresses many of these complex halachas. They needed a Talmud Chacham, and apparently Psachia fit the bill, who would be able to make these rulings and determinations to oversee the Kinim of Yoledes, make sure that everything was done kedas ukidin. So the impression you get is that although many of the names that are mentioned here in this Mishnah were not names of necessarily great scholars, but Psachia, because he was Memud al Akinim, he must have been a great scholar. And the Gemara and the Mishnah now wants to identify and reveal the secret of this Psachia. Who was he, this great scholar? He was Mordechai. And why is Mordechai called Psachia? Why not just call him Mordechai? Psachia shoya poseach dvarim vidarshan. That whenever there were psukim in the Torah that were very difficult to understand, they needed someone to open up the door and reveal the deeper meaning of a pasuk. Mordechai was the one that they called upon. He was a great darshan. He was a fabulous commentary and interpreter of the psukim of the Torah. And since he unlocked the mystery of many of the psukim of the Torah, he was called Psachia, to open on behalf of the Almighty those psukim. When you read a pasuk, especially in the Nevi'im like Yeshaya and Yirmiyah, etc., the words are very difficult to interpret. Mordechai was the expert on what we call etymology. He knew how to interpret the words of Lashon Kodesh, as well as the words in Aramaic, in Ezra, Nehemiah, etc. And he was the final authority on interpreting these psukim. Not only that, but Yodea B'Shivim Lashon. The entire episode of Bigsan V'Seresh, as recorded in the Megillah, was only possible because Mordechai knew 70 languages. It's not clear whether he spoke 70 languages, but at least he understood 70 languages, and he overheard their plotting to kill the king. So therefore, the word Pesachia, Pesach, also means to decipher something. And very often the words of other languages are far, even if you study that language, you don't know how to decipher the deeper meaning and the nuances in the language. And that's what Mordechai was great. Okay, fine. Now, this Achia that we said was presiding over the Nesachim to guarantee that they were B'Tara, he had a son, Ben Achia, and he was the physician. He was the court physician in the Beis Hamikdash. Al Choli Me'ayin. He was your gastro man. Why did they need a gastroenterologist who had a specific responsibility vis-a-vis the Kohanim to make sure that their stomachs, their intestines were working properly? The Gemara is going to have a whole discussion here about how the Kohanim would eat meat because of the mitzvah of Zichrei Kahuna with regard to a Karm Chatos and regard to an Asham, and even Shlomim, the Kohanim had to eat part of the meat, and what impact it had on the stomach, on, pardon the expression, the bowel movement. They were very often constipated. They suffered from chilshul. They needed a great expert. So this was Ben Achia. It always, it always intrigued me why the father was a great, shall we say, supervisor. His halachas and yediyah in taros to make sure that everything in the sachim and that includes yayin, shemen, and soles was all tar. And his son became a physician, sent him to medical school. Then we go on. Now we have what we call those who are moser nefesh on behalf of the tzibur. Probably they did not receive a salary. And one of the basic needs of the community back in the day, and especially in the Beis Hamikdash, was access to water. And ditches, cisterns had to be dug to keep and guarantee the health of the community, access to water. And there was a fellow by the name of Nechunya. Nechunya was the Chofer Sichen. He apparently volunteered to dig those cisterns so that the rainwater would collect, and there would be access to water on behalf of the entire tzibur. And again, a comment from Tiklin Chadatin that this was especially important during the time of the Olei Regolim, because when you made the trek from Dan or Beersheba to Yerushalayim, you had to make sure that there was water along the way. And this Nechunya would go around, and I don't know if he personally dug the ditches or at least he supervised the digging of the ditches in order to create cisterns of water for the Olei Regolim. So there's very little doubt in our minds as to how to classify this Nechunya. Was he mentioned here L'tova and L'bracha, or chas v'shalom the opposite? Surely he was mentioned L'bracha because of his sacrificial actions and great tircha on behalf of the tzibur. Now, I'm not sure about the next name. Maybe he came from a family of cheesemakers. I don't know. His name was Gvini, and he was Karos. He was the one who served the function of what we call in Yiddish, if anybody knows this word, a vecker. I remember when I was a youngster, I was 16 years old, and I was learning in a yeshiva called Kfar Chabad for the summer. And for a fellow from MTA, if you know that school, it was a pretty radical change. There was a very heavy-set Yemenite guy who was in charge of waking us up in the morning for davening. He was the vecker. We were absolutely terrified of him. He was very big, and he walked around with a stick, and he used to bang on the doors to wake us up. And when he came into the room, you knew you were in trouble if you were still in bed. For a guy coming from Brooklyn, New York, this was like wild. You opened up to see this fellow standing over your head with a stick. He was a vecker. A vek means to wake up. So back in the time of the Mikdash, the Kohanim had to begin their day very early, even before daybreak, with what's called Trumas HaDeshen. And this fellow, by the name of Gvini, would wake them up. Stay off, it's time to wake up and serve the Lord. Now, we have a real macho guy. He's a Gavra, if you know modern Hebrew. And he was called Ben Gever. If you voted for him, you voted 10th. Anyway, he was in charge of Ne'ilas HaSha'arim. And somebody had to be sure that the gates of the Beis HaMikdash were locked at night when the avodah was completed, so that no one would go into the Mikdash, because there was a lot of expensive stuff in the Mikdash. And then we get to somebody by the name of Ben Bevi, Hamemuna al Hapkia. Now, this has to do with the mitzvah of Hatovas Haneros. As you know, there was a double, twice a day, there was a mitzvah of Hadlokas Haneros, and the wicks and the oils had to be removed in order to prepare the menorah for the next Hadloka. And this Ben Pkia was in charge of making sure that the Hatovas Haneros was implemented properly. Now, there is a sugya in Masechet Yoma on Daf Chav Gimel, and the Gemara wonders what this Ben Bevi was in charge of. We said that the word Pekia comes from the word wicks, meaning the wicks in the menorah in the Mikdash. But the Gemara in Yuma actually comes to the conclusion that the word Pekia means a makel and a maka. Just like there was a mamuna for makis who gave 39 lashes, there was also a mamuna in charge of whipping in the Beis HaMikdash. And what was his job, and who was he whipping? And the answer is that not only was the Mikdash locked at night, but there were guards, Shomrim, Leviim, that had positions around the Mikdash, and very often they would fall asleep on the job because their major job was during the night. So this fellow by the name of Ben Bevi, he was in charge, another kind of a vecker, in this case for the Sha'arim, those who were in charge of guarding the gates of the Beis HaMikdash, to make sure that they were up and aware and doing their shmirah proper. Now we have a fellow who worked with the Leviim, as you know, during the Hakrava of Karbanos. There were Leviim who divided into two groups. There were Leviim who were in charge of what we call, let's call them vocalists. They were singing. And then there were those who were instrumentalists. They were playing on a whole variety of different instruments, one of which was called a tziltzal, in English, a cymbal. And it was important to make sure that all the instruments were in tune and they would fulfill that great, glorious mitzvah of hearing that integration of both vocalists and instrumentalists. The one in charge was Ben Arza. He would supervise and guarantee that the cymbals were sounded. Now, it seems that what you had to have was absolute, what we call sync, meaning synchronized. There had to be a synchronization, if there's such a word, of the singing of the Levium together with the instrumentals. And the Levium needed a cue to tell them, now's the time to start singing. They used the cymbals, which were presided by Ben Arza, and as soon as they heard that bang of the signals, the instrumentalists would start playing their instruments, and the singers would start singing their songs. The Gaon of Vilna said that the sounds of the Levium in this symphony were from a different world, not something that you and I have exposure to with all the great musicians and composers that we're familiar with. Next, we have to get the singers, until now the instrumentalists, and according to the Rambam, actually, this Ben Arza was in charge of the instrumentalists. We needed a fellow, in this case, Hugras ben Levi. He was in charge of the shir, and he had the job of making sure that the singers, the Levium ha-mishorerim, would begin to sing at the proper time, and they would end at the proper time. You could say that he was like a conductor of a symphony orchestra. Now we get to the last part of this Mishnah, and this has to do with basically the various parts of the Avodas HaMikdash that were not related to the Karbanos per se. For example, we have the Lechem Aponim. The Lechem Aponim, which were placed on the Shulchan on a weekly basis from Shabbos to Shabbos, were eaten by Zichrei Kahuna. And the only part of this procedure, of this avoda that went to the Mikdash for Torah, was the Levona, the accompanying Levona. But the Lechem itself was not Nikrav al Gabi Mizbeach. Now, there had to be a chief baker who would oversee the baking of the Lechem Aponim. His name was Beis Garmu. No, his name was not Beis Garmu. Beis Garmu was a family that had the expertise of baking the Lechem Aponim. The Lechem Aponim were very complicated. They're not like our Lechamim. We have a loaf that looks more or less square. The Lechem Aponim had to be like an open tent. It had no roof on it, and it was triangular in shape in certain cases. Anyway, the expert on this was a member of a family called Beis Garmu. In this family, they had a tradition that they passed on from one generation to the other within their descendants of how to bake the Lechem Aponim. They had all the secrets of the Lechem Aponim. Now, okay, so that's more or less what we know about Beis Garmu. The big question here in the Sugya, and as a parallel Sugya in Yoma, is whether or not this Beis Garmu were being selfish and hoarding all that knowledge about how to create the Lechem HaPodim and make sure that the Lechem HaPodim wouldn't spoil, and he wouldn't share it with anybody else. And we're going to see the same question with regard to the Ketores. Beis Avtinas al Maisa Ketores. The family of Avtinas had the secrets of how to make the Ketores. As you know, the Ketores was made up of Samamonim, of 13 different spices, and that would produce the Ketores. And this family had the secret of producing the Ketores. Now, why is it so complicated to make the Ketores? And the answer is that in addition to the Samamonim, they had to add something called Male Oshan. And this was like a magical kind of ingredient. Nobody except for Beis Avtinas knew how to find this out there in the wild. The Mila Oshan had the ability to guarantee that the Ketores would have a timores that would go a pillar of smoke that went up vertically and then spread to the right and to the left. And the secret of Mila Oshan was held in the family from generation to generation of the Beis Avtinas. Elazar ala parochos. Elazar was in charge of the curtains. Okay, now this is very complicated. The Mishnah, if you take a look, fast forward for a second to the last Mishnah in Masechet Shekalim, or the next to the last Mishnah, which is on Daf Chaf Aleph Amid Beis, the Mishnah tells us that there were 13 parochos, or curtains in the Migdash, during the period of Bayis Sheni. And in fact, in Bayis Sheni, there were no walls that separated the Heichal from the Kodesh Kadosh. There were only 2 parochos. But in addition to these 2 parochos, there were 7 parochos at the shar that entered into the Azara. And there was another paroches that led to the Ulam, which was the outer courtyard that led into the Heichal. And then there were the additional 2 parochos that separated the Heichal itself from the Kodesh Kadosh. And this was a very complicated business. Why? Because the Mishnah establishes, in the name of Shimon Gamliel, that the parochas had to fit some very, very definite and detailed volumes or measurements. Each parochas had to be ovya tefach al shivim ushtayim nimim mereges. It was woven on 72 nimin. Now, for nimin, we have to go back to our study of Masechet Shabbos in terms of Meleches Ariga. If you remember, there's a whole parak called Perika Oreg, and there were 72 nimim. The nimim were those strings that went into the base near. Those are the holes in the heddles, in the shafts that were used for winding the chutim, the threads in and out, so that there was a shasi and an orev, and they had to do 72 of them. And not only that, the size of these parochas had to be very definite. The orech had to be 40 amma. These were massive curtains. And the rochav had to be 20 amma. And the Mishnah describes a process of tvila. They had to, they would change the parochas every so often. It got dirty and so forth and so on. And when they took out the old parochas and replaced it with a new one. They had to be matfil it to guarantee that it had tara. In any event, the fellow, the chap who was in charge of overseeing this entire process was none other than Elazar. Upinchas Hamalbish. And finally, the last on this list of 15 Memunim was Pinchas. And he was in charge of Big Day Kahuna. He had to make sure and guarantee that all the Big Day Kahuna were kept properly. Every set of Big Day Kahuna was designated for a Kohen who would pick it up the next morning and would place the begadim on his body, because a Kohen who does avodah without the proper Big Day Kahuna is chayav misa, and his avodah is avodah psula. So this fellow by the name of Pinchas, doesn't surprise me, he was a Kohen, and his name was Pinchas. He would make sure that the Kohanim would don the Big Day Kahuna and remove them. That's called Levisha and Pshita. He would be in charge of guarding and maintaining the Tara. And not only that, the Big Day Kahuna had to be spiffy. If they were worn out, or if even they were filthy, they were possibly avoda. The standards and requirements of the Big Day Kahuna were on the highest level. That was his job. The Gemara tells us that the second Beis Hamikdash lasted 10 years longer than the first. First Beis Hamikdash lasted for 410, the second Beis Hamikdash 420. And the question is, why did our Mishnah have to mention the names of these 15 individuals who were Memunim during the period of Beis Hamikdash Hasheni? Reb Chizki Omar Reb Simon v'Rabbanon. Reb Chizki records a machlokas between Reb Simon and the Rabbanon. We don't know who holds what, but Chad Omar, according to one opinion, Ksherei dar v'dar ba limnos. And in fact, the Mishnah wants to be Makayim, the halacha of Zecher Tzadik Livracha, which you can only fulfill by mentioning a person by name. And the 15 people whose names are enumerated on our Mishnah, they served over the course of centuries. These were not coexistent Memunim, and they were mentioned Lebracha. The implication is that during this period of 4 centuries plus, most of the Memunim were not mentioned Lebracha. And that's a little bit scary, but we know that Bayis Sheni was not all that it was cracked up to be. Charnomer, according to another opinion, Misha Haya Bioso Dor Monamasha Bidoro. The author of the Mishnah just mentions those who were in his generation. All these 15 that are named here in our Mishnah lived, coexisted simultaneously. And it's very possible that every generation had Memunim who are tzaddikim. There's no implicit critique here, but it just happens to be that this 15 names are names of people who lived at the time of the Mishnah. So when the author of the Mishnah listed the Memunim, these are the names that he listed. The other opinion here in the Gemara is that no, these people lived at different times and they were singled out Libracha because they were the tzaddikim during this period of 420 years. It's amazing that Tosfos in Masechet Yoma has a list by name based on the Tosefta of those Kohanim Gedolim who were Ksherim. And the list it's not a very long list. 420 years worth of Kohanim Gedolim. In fact, Chazal tell us there were hundreds upon hundreds of Kohanim Gedolim during the time of Beis Hamikdash. Over 300 Kohanim Gedolim. Most of the Kohanim Gedolim didn't live out the year as a Kohen Gadol. because the influence of the tzdukim. They would die on Yom Kippur in the Kodesh Kadoshim, and to carry them out with a string, a rope that pulled their corpse out. It was horrible. The good news is, by the way, in the names of the Kohanim Gedolim, I always point this out, that were the good guys during Bayis Sheni, most of them had the name Azariah, or their father was Azariah. So that's the consolation prize here. Anyway, so again, we have listed in this Mishnah, we have a fellow by the name of Hugras, who was a Levi. He was in charge of Shir. We had the Beis Garmu that were in charge of the Lechem Aponim. We had the Beis Havtinos that were in charge of the Ketores. So the Gemara says, again, there are a lot of Girsa problems in this Gemara, but Mandi Omar Ksherei Kol Dar V'Dar Balamanos, according to the last opinion that we had, is Aleim Hu Omer, with regard to, and we'll see why these three families are singled out, but Zecher Tzadik Livrach, right? Because the second opinion was that these families were mentioned Libracha, and basically what the Mishnah is now telling us is that there are others who are Rishayim, and now we have to mention that this Gemara, it's one of those Yushalmis that leave out the punchline, so to speak. We have to fill in the punchline. The Gemara here is alluding to Mishnayos in Masechet Yoma, without actually quoting them. In the third parak of Yoma, the Mishnah mentions that there are two groups of people, one of which is mentioned Liklola, and we'll see exactly why the Rishonim have to be mentioned Liklola. The others are mentioned Libracha because they were Tzaddikim. And the Mishnah mentions this fellow by the name of Ben Gamla and others who actually were in charge of what we call Bedek HaBayis. They made improvements in the Beis HaMikdash. And then the Mishnah in Yoma goes on to mention other families, Liklola, apparently because they had secrets that they refused to share with others, and they hoarded it for themselves and for their descendants. In that Mishnah, Beis Garmo is mentioned, who, as we said before, were the experts on the Lechem Aponim. Beis Havtinos is mentioned. They were the experts on the Ketores. Hugras, Halevi was mentioned, the expert on Shira. And all of these came under the Bikoret, the critique of the Mishnah in Yoma, because they refused to share their knowledge with others. And then the Mishnah says that with regard to the first list of those who were in charge of Bedek HaBayis, and they would fix up the Beis HaMikdash, they would improve, for example, if there were cracks in the walls, they are mentioned Libracha. The second list is mentioned Liklol. Now, if that be the case, let's see how we can reconcile our Mishnah here in Shekalim with the Mishnah in Yoma. Because if you derive from the Mishnah in Yoma that these various families here that are mentioned here in our Mishnah as well are mentioned for a bikoret, for critique, as we said before, they didn't share it with others, then those mentioned in that Mishnah in Yoma, who are also mentioned in our Mishnah, well, wait a second. How do you understand that? Now, if you assume that those who are mentioned in Mishnah, in our Mishnah, like for example, Hugras or Beis Havtinus or Beis Garma, these were the good guys, then the Mishnah in Yoma considers them Rishayim. Were they mentioned for praise, Lebracha, as would seem to be indicated according to at least one man Yomer, that they were mentioned, singled out Lebracha, or as the Mishnah in Yoma seems to indicate, they were mentioned Leklola because they refused to share their knowledge, their insights into how to make the Ketores and the Shtei Lechem, and the Lechem Aponim with others. So the Gemara says, Man the Omer Ksherei Kol Dar V'Dar Bo Limnos, V'Al Aleinu Omer Zecher Tzadik Livracha, which means that we had the earlier part of the Mishnah in Yoma, those who are in charge of Bedek HaBayis, they were mentioned Livracha, but the second group of people who were in charge of the musicians, of the singers, who were in charge of the Lechem Aponim and the Ketores, they seem to be mentioned here in our Mishnah Libracha. They were the tzaddikim, and yet in the Mishnah and Yoma, they're being censured because they didn't share their knowledge with the people at large. Very difficult to reconcile our Mishnah with the Mishnah in Yoma. And Mandi Yoma Misha Hayabi also Adar Mona Masha Bidoro. So the first Mandi Yoma was Ksherei Kol Dar V'Dar Bo Limnos. That's really problematic because there were many, many people who fit these minuyim that are not listed, and the ones that are listed are the ones that were the tzaddikim of all these generations. How do you reconcile that with the Mishnah Yom? However, according to the other Mandi Yomer that says that it was only the author of our Mishnah who was recording who were the people in charge of these 15 jobs at the time of that Mishnah, when that Mishnah was recorded, is then Al Kulanu Omer V'Shem Rishon Yirka, that those who are enumerated in our Mishnah, Hayabi also Hadar, they're only mentioned coincidentally, and they lucked out. They were mentioned in the Mishnah. Well, actually, they weren't so lucky, but because they were the ones who served at the time of the Mishnah. They weren't necessarily tzaddikim. On the contrary, we could say that they were censured, they were rishayim because they refused to share their knowledge with others. Now, the language here of the Yushalmi is very difficult. It says, Al kulanu omer v'shem rishayim yirkov. I mean, that's impossible. You can't take this Yushalmi at face value because Sachya is Mordechai. I mean, he's mentioned in our Mishnah. You can't say Shem Rishayim Yirka, which is the end of the pasuk Zecher Tzadik Livracha, the pasuk in Mishlei. So we're going to have to say that Al Kulanu Omer means amongst all of them, some of them fit this category of Shem Rishayim Yirka. And then we can reconcile our Mishnah with the Mishnah in Yoma, because these last groups of people were Shem Rishayim Yirka. Valmi Nemar Zecher Tzadik Livracha, but on the other hand, the Mishnah in Yoma at the beginning of the Mishnah mentions Tzadikim, Al Ben Kotin V'Chaverav. So in the earlier Mishnah in Yoma, a fellow by the name of Ben Kotin is mentioned, Melech Munbaz is mentioned, Heleni Amalka, and Nicanor. All the above were mentioned Libracha because they improved the Beis Hamikdash. They were in charge of Tikkun, or what we call Bedek HaBayis. But the later enumerations of names in the Mishnah and Yoma, they are not mentioned lebracha, they're mentioned leklola, and they are identical with some of those names mentioned in our Mishnah because of the fact that they were very selfish. So here on the top of Daf Yud Gimel Amid Beis, the Gemara quotes a pasuk. Amar Rabbi Yonah Ksiv quotes a pasuk in Yeshayahu Navi regarding the praise that we give to someone who is praiseworthy, does good things, Maisim Tovim. Lachein achalek lo barabim. V'es atzumim yechalek shalom. The Gemara now is going to take a pasuk in Yeshaya and it's going to interpret this prophecy as referring to various great personalities and leaders in Jewish history way down the line, way past the generation of Yeshayahu and Navi. I will assign him a portion barabim. Now, I'm not sure what barabim means. Barabim either means publicly or from amongst the rabbim, I single out him. And he has Torah. Torah is always called shalom, booty. Right? Booty is that which we, possessions of the adversaries that we confiscate as a result of victory in war. And that's always a metaphor for the Torah itself. There, Rabbi Akiva, who's this individual who divvies up the spoils, meaning the shalom, which is Torah, and he transmits the Torah to his generation? That's none other than Rabbi Akiva. And he gets a portion amongst the rabbim, which means either losid lovo publicly or perhaps of all the rabbim he singled out. And what is great about Rabbi Akiva that you would say the word achalik or yechalik shalom? Apparently he took the Torah, Rabbi Akiva, and he divided up into disciplines. Shehiskin Mishnah, Medrash, Halachos, V'Agados. In other words, the Torah was somewhat before Rabbi Akiva came along. Now, again, I don't know if this is before the tragedy of maybe after the tragedy of the death of the 24,000 students, but the Torah was sort of like mixed up. And Rabbi Akiva was able to divvy up the Torah into various disciplines. And this has tremendous halachic repercussions because Chazal tell us that, first of all, a person has to divvy up his day in Torah study, and 1/3 should be Torah Shebechsav, another third should be Mishnah, and a third should be Gemara. So Rabbi Akiva set up the bounds of what's considered Mishnah, what's considered Gemara, Torah Shebal Peh, but it also has to do with another set of halachos called the halachos of Shoel Umeshiv, meaning that if a Rebbe is transmitting Torah and two students want to be recognized simultaneously, the question is, and this is a very severe halachic question to be taken seriously, to whom does the Rebbe give first preference? Got Ruvain is raising his hand. He insists on asking a question. Shimon is raising his hand. They're both jumping out of their seats. And here we have to divide up the Torah into various disciplines. So, for example, if Ruvain is asking a question on Mishnah, he'll get preference to Shimon, who's asking a question about Medrash. If Ruvain is asking a question about Medrash, and Shimon is asking a question about Agadah, then Ruvain gets preference because Medrash is a revelation and an interpretation of Torah Shebechsav. And we always give preference to Torah Shebechsav. If, on the other hand, Ruvain is asking a halacha l'maisa question, then even if Shimon is asking a question about Mishnah, we're going to give Ruvain first Meishiv. We'll answer his question because Allah L'maisa is always considered absolutely critical and urgent. Yesh Omrim, others say that this pasuk in Yeshayahu Navi is alluding not to an individual, but to a body of scholars. Elu Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. And the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah were in charge of Mishnah, Medrash, Halachos, and Agados. So now the question is, if that's the case, then why is Rabbi Akiva considered great? What did he contribute to the Mesores HaTorah that was not contributed by the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, who divided up the Torah into these four disciplines? Ella, Ma Tikin Zeh, what was Rabbi Akiva in charge of? Klolos Upratos. What is Klolos Upratos? And here we have a gigantic machlokes about Rabbi Akiva and what his contribution was to Torah Sheba'al Peh. According to one interpretation, which apparently reflects upon the Sifra, Rabbi Akiva was in charge of something called Klal Uprat. Now, one of the various midos shator nidreshes bahen is Klal Uprat, and it's very complicated because it often depends upon which came first, the Klal or the Prat. If the Klal comes first, then the Prat comes to whittle down the Klal. If, on the other hand, the Prat comes first, then the Klal is coming to expand the Prat, give it a broader application. Another issue that comes up in Klal Uprat is Mufne, whether or not the Torah had to add something, because if there was a reason compelling the Torah to add the Prat, because we wouldn't have derived the Prat from the Klal, then it could be the Klal stands on its own and the Prat stands on. In any event, there are many complicated nuances in how to use this midah and when to apply it of Klal Uprat. And the expert on that, who taught us for all generations how to interpret psukim based on Klal Uprat and derive halachas that are appropriate, was Rabbi Akiva. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that Rabbi Akiva, when it comes to klolos upratos, he was able to interpret any particular law, any din, and determine whether that din was a klal or a prat. In this sense, Rabbi Akiva is going way beyond the particular midah shator nidreshes ban in terms of the methodology, the hermeneutic principles of how to derive halachas from psukim. No, Rabbi Akiva is looking at the entire Torah and all the multitudes of halachas, and he's organizing them as either klolim or pratim. Is this halacha a detail independent of a klal, or is it indicative of a general rule of a klal? Now, I wanted to add something here in the name of the Taklin Chadatim. This pasuk that we're dealing with in Yeshayahu Hanavi, Achalek Lo Barabim, is according to Rabbi Yonah a reference to Rabbi Akiva. And Hashem somehow, Achalek Lo Barabim, assigns to Rabbi Akiva a portion together with the Rabbin. What does that mean? And he says that the Rabbim here referred to the tzaddikim in Olam Haba. And Rabbi Akiva will be together with Rabbim. Who are these Rabbim that will join Rabbi Akiva in Olam Haba. And he says that this refers to the multitude of Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. Now, wait a second. It's true that Rabbi Akiva had a multitude of Talmidim, but they all perished. And then Rabbi Akiva went down south, and he was Mamid Chamisha Talmidim. He basically had 5 disciples. So now he teaches originally the multitudes, and then at the end of his life, he teaches just a small group of disciples. And according to the Vilna Gaon, and now we're talking about the Tachton Kadatin, these 5 Talmidim transmitted Torah to the multitudes. And quoting a Gemara in Sanhedrin on Daf Samach Vav, everything that we know from the Tanoim, because again, this is before Rebbe codified the Mishnah, comes through these 5 Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, this very second small group of Tanoim. So now we could say the following, that everything that we have in Mishnah, in Medrash, in Halachos and Agados, all the Tanoic teachings come from Rabbi Akiva. And therefore, Achalik lo barabin. Now, Achalik lo barabin means, Rabin, we said, was the Talmidim of his Talmidim through the generations. But now it says, Vesatsumim yichalek shalom. What does that mean? He will divide spoils with the mighty. Rabbi Akiva was at the time of what's called Haruge Lud. And you may remember that the Romans, when they subjugated the Jewish people, they accused the Jews of murder because the Roman emperor had a daughter who was murdered. And the murderers apparently ran to the city of Lud. And the Romans were about to completely destroy the entire city of Lud unless the murderers would come forward and confess their crimes. So 2 fellows who were absolutely guiltless came forward and confessed that they had murdered the emperor's daughter, and that lie was fabricated in order to save the city of Lud. They were put to death. They were executed by the Romans, and they are called the Haruge Lud. In this pasuk, in Yeshayahu Hanavi, the Atzumim, the mighty ones, is an allusion to the Haruge Lud. Their names were Lulianos and Pappus. Very strange Roman names that they had. But again, those were names that were apparently used by Jews at that time. And as I said before, they were put to death. The story of Haruge Lud is recorded in 2 sugyas in Shas. Here it's only alluded to, in Psachim and in Bava Basra. And they are called Atzumim. Atzumim refers to someone who's Makadesh Shem Shemayim. He gives up his life al Kiddush Hashem. And then, if you read the end of this pasuk, we don't have it here in our Gemara, it says, Asher hera lemaves nafsha. Now, lemaves nafsha is a reference to the Kiddush Hashem, to the martyrdom. Very appropriate topic for these days, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, for the martyrdom of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva defied the Roman decree, and he taught Torah publicly, and he was put to death in the most cruel what word am I looking for? Torturous way. So now the pasuk should be read as follows. Number one, Lachein achalik lo barabim. In the future, at the end of days, when God will reward the tzaddikim, liasid lavo, it will be Rabbi Akiva together with the multitudes of all the talmidim and the talmidim of the generations of scholars who received the Torah through the talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. And es hatzumim yechalek sholo, God will give out tremendous rewards to the atzumim, those who were sacrificed their lives al kiddush Hashem. And then the end of the pasuk says, Asher hera lamoves nafsha. Hera is miloshen irui, to pour something. He poured out his soul for death. That's Rabbi Akiva, who was executed publicly by the Romans. Now, at this point, the Gemara goes on to speak about how to interpret the Torah and then transmit it to the next generation. Rabbi Avo, we don't have much time. Ksiv, the pasuk tells us in Divrei Hayomim about someone by the name of Salma ben Kalev ben Chur, and the Gemara wants to know who this Salma was. Ksiv mishpachos sofrim yoshvei yabetz. This pasuk refers to Sofrim, who dwelt in a place called Yabetz. Matam Malom Sofrim. What does it mean that these great teachers were called Sofrim? Elu sha'asos haTorah sforos. Wherever you find in Shas a number, like for example, my grandson is learning now Arba Avos Nezikin. Or we made a siyum here of Mishnais from my father-in-law, Shalom, and we learned the Mishnah in Trumos. Chamisha shetarmu trumasam truma. Or, for example, the Mishnah we learned together in Paraklal Gadol, that Arbaim Chaser Achas, there are 39 malachas. And throughout Shas, there are always numbers that are being given. That's the way we remember the halachas. And that's why these are called Sofrim. These are scholars. Sha'asos haTorah sforos. For example, Chamisha lo yisromu truma, Chamisha dvarim chayovim b'chala, Chameshtei noshim potros soroseyen. That's what we're going to study in Hashem towards the end of the week. And then Chameshtei noshim potros, and then Shloshim v'sheish kresos b'Torah, 36 different violations of a chiv kares in the Torah. Shlosha sar nemru b'nivlas ha'or atar. So Nevel of Tar has 13 different dinim of Tuma V'Tara, as they are listed in Masechet Shekalim and also in Mishnais Taros. Arbaim Avos Nezikin, Avos Malachas Chaser, Arbaim Chaser Achas. These are the Sofrim who give us the numbers, which makes it easier to facilitate to use these numbers as instruments and memory devices to remember the Torah. It also organizes the Torah when you have the numbers. So that's why they're called Sofrim. So this is where we'll stop for today. Wish you all a great day. And in Mitzvah Hashem, later this week, we'll be starting Yevamos. I'll give you at least a day's notice, so don't get